Hello and welcome to Speaking with Sonnet. Today we have the lovely Miss Henry and we are going to talk about the curious incident of the dog in the night time. So this is your literature paper 2 and it's the question that you don't have an extract for, so you have to know the play very well. I think this is the one you might agree where students seem to struggle the most in terms of talking about context.
Yes.
And in terms of talking about the context, the audience reaction, the reason for writing that the writer had. I just think sometimes students are not really very clear, even themselves, about the contextual aspects of this.
Absolutely, and I think that both the novelist Mark Haddon and Simon Stevens, who created the play version that we study, made it very clear that the themes of both novel and play are families coping with struggle. But because the key protagonist in both novel and play is a character who is non-neurotypical and has big issues, then I think sometimes we get a bit sidetracked by that myth.
Yeah, so it was a novel first of all. All right, so it's this novel called The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, surprisingly, and published in 2004, and actually it's from Christopher's point of view. So this is the novel, this is what you would read. It was 7 minutes after midnight, it starts in the same way with the dog being dead, but it has the personal pronoun, so the narrative comes from Christopher's own point of view. I decided the dog was probably killed. I went through Mrs. Shears's gate. The dog was called Wellington. So what you get in this book very clearly, and they actually are able to use things like this, so little illustrations, you're able to get a really insightful awareness of how somebody with Christopher's neural non-typicality, how his brain works. But obviously you can't have him speaking everything that he thinks on the stage, and the way that they have transferred that onto the stage is through the use of things like the book and the dramatic techniques, like the lighting and the sound and the ensemble characters. But yeah, to go back to what Miss Henry said, it's all about the fact that this is a book about families and the struggle that the family has with Christopher, who is a child that has this non-neurotypicality, doesn't it? But what we were saying is it doesn't mean that the whole book is about Christopher and it's like Asperger's, isn't it? Although it's never stated.
It's never stated, but he appears to be on the spectrum, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And he appears to be very high functioning in some ways, academically, but very low functioning with social interactions. Barking like a dog and rolling on the floor. Yeah. Clearly non-neurotypical behaviour.
Yeah. So what we're going to do in this little vlog today is we're going to explore how Christopher is actually... There are elements of both Ed and Judy in him. So he's not this child that is completely divorced from Judy and Ed. They've not just found him, in the cabbage patch and gone, oh, look at this lovely children, let's take him home. No. He has elements, like all children have. Your children and my children, you look at them and you think, oh, that's just like me, oh, that's just
absolutely.
like
and you look at your parents and I look at my parents and think, oh my Lord,
I'm turning
so
into
like
my
mother. Yeah.
So who should we start with first, Ed or Judy?
Should we do Ed?
Yeah, definitely. So do you just want to say some things about Ed as a character and then we can find where it's reflected in Christopher?
Well, I think there's a great tendency, a knee-jerk tendency, really, I suppose, because Ed does something pretty terrible, doesn't he?
Yes.
He tells the worst lie you can possibly imagine to his son about the death of Christopher's mother. But you've got to remember he's a man on the edge, isn't he? He's a man who has been pushed beyond. And, the reason he my interpretation of the reason he first of all says she's unwell and in hospital and then that she's died is that obviously things are happening and she's telling him she's running off with Mr. Shears, and he's, who knows, trying to make it not happen, and then it happens and she's dead to him at that point, isn't she?
So the quote that he uses on page 12 is Ed says, no, it's an ordinary hospital, she has a problem with her heart, and you get this ellipsis, so there's an element of him pausing, and I think at that point you think to yourself, it can go either way. But he talks about her having a problem with her heart, which I think you can infer is metaphorical.
Oh, absolutely.
She's, broken his heart, and
her heart's closed to him.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So he does this awful thing, but he does it because he is trying to protect Christopher. Or do you think he does it because he wants to hurt Judy?
I tend to think he does it to protect Christopher.
Yeah.
But then I think that's because of what I've read about, as I say, both the original author and playwrights' desire to show how families can almost break themselves, apparently, in a way that can't be resolved, and then steps are made towards that, and therefore there's a positive outcome. So, having said that, well, obviously then he has to hide the letters, but that's because he's told the lie.
Yeah.
I imagine that he deeply regrets having said that, but it cannot be unsaid.
So in terms of this in Christopher then, you could say that he does something wrong, but he thinks the right reason, but that leads to more lies. And you could say that happens with Christopher when he goes and finds the book again, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
So Ed tells him, I don't want you to go and find the book.
Makes it very clear.
And then Christopher goes and finds it again. So again, he's like linking back to Ed in terms of being stubborn.
Yes, and absolutely. And being, perhaps that's a slightly other thing, but quick to anger also, isn't he?
Yeah. And being quite deceitful.
Yeah.
And his deceit leads on to something that becomes bigger than him, which is what happens with Ed as well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like his deceit leads to Judy, being out of Christopher's life in the worst possible way.
Yes.
You can't come back from being dead.
Indeed. And I hope I'm quoting correctly, because Ed says at one point, we're very like, buddy, you and I, when the red mist descends.
Yeah.
So don't isolate Christopher as, he's non-neurotypical, therefore everything he does in terms of his relationship with his parents is not like a neurotypical child's relationship would be, because I don't think that's the view of the director.
No. And I think the thing is that as teachers and students, we tend to look at Christopher and his condition. So I'll just say Asperger's to make it easier, and that tends to be like the big thing. But there's also so many subtleties. He is very much like Ed. So like Miss said, he's very quick to have a temper. So when the first way we see this is when he hits the policeman. Okay, so on page 5, the policeman tries to lift him up and Christopher screams, he hits the policeman, which is the same sort of thing as Ed does when they're arguing.
Yes.
Isn't it? And he actually hits or shakes Christopher at various times, so there's this kind of physical reaction from both of them in times of stress.
Yeah. And we know that Christopher doesn't like being touched, and we know that's part of his condition. But we still want you to think about the fact that he, like father, like son to some extent.
Absolutely. And so yes, when Ed does have this confession to Christopher, I'm just going to go back to page 34, because this is where Ed says, Ed grabs Christopher's arm, Christopher screams, they fight each other, Ed shakes Christopher hard with both hands, Christopher falls unconscious for a few seconds. And actually that is very typical, not so much the physical aspect of it, but that is typical of relationships between parents and teenagers, is that they fight.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's conflict.
Yeah.
Isn't there? This is what he says about the red mist comes down. So this is on page 47. Christ, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, we're not that different, me and you.
Do you also see Ed, I see Ed as a kind of everyman figure.
Absolutely.
He's not overly bright, he's not overly educated, he's not overly wealthy. He's your standard man and dad who is really struggling with life.
Yeah.
And because you probably have noticed that quite a lot of the time he, we might hope in a perfect world when Christopher goes into his flights of fantasy, the things that are important to him, his detecting, his interest in the stars, his interest in mathematics. Ed doesn't really respond very much, and you just, maybe as a parent, perhaps you as students could think about, oh my goodness, Ed probably hears all of this over and over
God.
again on a daily basis.
But when you've got, small children and they're just yabbering on about absolute nonsense, and you're just kind of like, oh my God, Mum, do you think a baby spider could eat a baby? And you're just like, and I think, yeah, he's just old, but because he's older, you expect Ed to have a bit more of an engagement with him on an adolescent level. I don't know how it happens.
But I want to get Ed positive now. I love the fact that Ed is so ambitious for Christopher.
Yes.
Academically.
Yeah, so on page 22, he said he has this argument with Mrs. Gascoigne, and he said, Christopher is getting a enough deal already, don't you think, without you him from a great height as well? Jesus, this is the one thing he's really good at. And I think what that shows is that Ed, obviously as a father, is prepared to fight for Christopher. But like you said before, it does highlight his lack of education, that he can come and speak to a teacher in that way and swear at her and not really understand
and offer to bung her 50 quid.
Yeah. Go on and give her an A star. And you could also say that that's very similar to Christopher in the fact that both of them don't really know how to talk to other people.
Yes.
Ed does this. It is a time where he's under a lot of stress as well, isn't he? He's trying to fight for Christopher, but again, he doesn't sort of do it in the correct way.
He's been thrown over by Mrs. Shears, hasn't he?
Yes.
Hence the dog, the poor old dog.
Yeah, and that's another thing that I think sometimes you can forget is the fact that Ed killed the dog because it just came after Mrs. Shears basically saying she didn't want anything to do with him in a romantic way.
Yes.
So he was lonely. He probably, sometimes if something bad happens and then there's this something else that's little and small, but that actually is so impactful because it links. So it's obviously like Mrs. Shears rejecting him is
the
actually
straw that breaks the camel's back.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
But we don't talk in metaphors because
oh no, because Christopher wouldn't like that.
Yeah, the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Sorry, Christopher.
Which it is, I think, and Mrs. Shears, by saying she didn't want them, and I think also because he says to you and I. So I think he was looking at Mrs. Shears as being a mother figure to Christopher.
Oh, definitely.
In a way,
I agree.
And actually, I think the fact that he didn't, So this is on page 47. This is what Ed says. She said some things I'm not going to say to you because they're not very nice. I think she cared more for that bloody dog than for us, and maybe it's not so stupid looking back. So I think he had this sort of idea that maybe he could recreate a family.
And I think because single parenting is tough, but single parenting a non-neurotypical kid like Christopher, he was probably getting hope that would happen, and that would be supportive with Christopher as well, wasn't it?
Yeah. And again, to remind you, the context is all about families. So if you were going to write a question on Ed, you can talk about the fact that maybe he was trying to recreate a family.
Yes.
But it would be more difficult for someone like Mrs. Shears to take on a child like Christopher. I mean, look what happens to Roger and Judy.
Oh, he can't cope. He turns to the bottle, doesn't he?
Yeah, and then, Judy leaves. So, Christopher, the difficulty of parenting somebody like Christopher, if you're not their biological parent, why stick around?
Wow, that would be tough.
Yeah.
Shall we seg that into Judy then?
Yeah, let's go for Judy, who is the mother.
Yeah.
So we were talking about similarities between Judy and Christopher. One of them is the fact that they're quite imaginative, aren't they? So Christopher had these sort of ideas about being an astronaut, or I'm going to do once the play finishes, I can do anything. And Judy, when she's talking about her view of living in France with a handyman called Jean,
and smoking Gauloise.
Yes. Yeah. And so this is on page 33. If I hadn't married your father, I think I'd been living in a little farmhouse in the south of France with someone called Jean. And I think that she has these sort of imaginative ideas because she can't cope with her life.
I agree with you. But Miss, because I have these discussions with students, do you judge her for sharing that fantasy with her young son?
No. In fact, I am much more sympathetic towards Judy than my students are. They tend to hate her.
That's very interesting. Well, that could lead to all sorts of gender-related issues about how we feel about mothering versus how we feel about fathering, couldn't it?
Yes. and everyone thinks that Ed is such a good guy because he stays and Judy leaves. But she does leave because she thinks it's the right thing to do.
She does.
And and what I think is so sad for Ed is that both Christopher and Judy, they both leave him because they think it's the right thing to do. And so there's that element of like mother, like son, of running away when things.
Yes.
I mean, they're different.
With different motives, but yeah, that's a good point. But is Judy actually very self-aware then? Which I don't know is that is a characteristic that Ed shares. When she recognises her inability to cope with Christopher, I find it very poignant when she talks about the issues that she faced with Christopher when they went shopping. Christopher's atypical behaviour. She seems to tell us, doesn't she, that she was much less able to cope with that than Ed was.
Yeah, and she says things like, oh, hang on a minute. She's very much like, she says on page 42, I was not a very good mother, Christopher. Maybe if things had been different, maybe if you'd been different, I might have been better at it. So I think in a way she's ignorant. I don't think she's being deliberately cruel. I think she's confessing, isn't she?
So she sees that letter as something of a confessional.
Yeah.
But to say maybe if you'd been different, I find that quite difficult to. I find it quite difficult to empathise with her when she says that. Maybe if you'd been different.
This is the whole kind of the crux of the play. How much of that would Christopher be aware of?
Well, indeed, it could be that as somebody who lives very much in his own head.
Yeah.
That wouldn't impact on him.
Because the whole point is that he's got a very particular mind, and that's how the director and the people talk about that, his particular mind. So maybe, because he never thinks beyond what is clear and real, maybe if you've been different, well, I'm not different, so I can't really compute what you're saying.
It could be.
But then again, that can be used as something that is very negative towards Judy, isn't it?
Yes.
Certainly say if you're having an argument against her, she's got no understanding of Christopher.
No.
She should have left.
So because she had no understanding, it was best she left.
Yeah. Because even in her confession, she's kind of getting things wrong all the time, isn't she?
Oh, yes. And of course, when they are reunited, she shows her lack of insight into Christopher, doesn't she? With her desire that they put off the A-level. Yeah. Because it's impractical. She's in London, it would be in Swindon. We'll do that next year. And, Ed has a much more in-depth understanding. Yeah. Then she's been away for 2.5 years,
So even when they first see him, and she's like, Christopher, this is on page 76, Christopher, and Christopher says, what? And you understand that Judy would be like, Christopher, you're here. What? And then she goes to hug him. He pushes her away so hard that he falls over. So the very first moment that the mother and son are reunited, there's this disconnect between what she wants and him and what he needs. And that's the whole point of their relationship, isn't it, in a way?
Yes. And because of his distancing, the distancing that his condition, the way he lives, it's very poignant, isn't it? Because then she asks if she could just hold his hand.
Yeah.
And he says, I don't like holding people's hands.
Yeah.
Not, not even acknowledging,
mother.
But maybe I could make an exception because you're my mother.
Yeah, I know. And then Ed obviously comes and he's very angry, but then he does go away again because I think he thinks he knows Christopher and he knows what Christopher needs.
Yes. He realises it can only be baby steps, doesn't he? And that when Christopher and Judy go back to Swindon, Ed, I like to think, and I think that's one of the messages of the play, is that there's a big learning curve for all three of them.
All three of them, absolutely. Who do you sympathise with the most?
Well, I've been lucky enough to see the play in performance a couple of times actually, and I have found that my sympathy to Judy is greater having seen it on the stage.
Yes, because I think she comes across on the stage as being quite fragile.
Yes.
And I think Ed comes across as being harder and more aggressive, especially when they're arguing or he's swearing.
Yes.
And I think Siobhan is, the heroine of this.
She steps into the parenting gap, really,
Yes,
doesn't she?
Absolutely.
Which is quite dangerous for her, because then the lines blur for Christopher, and he asks if he can come and live with her, doesn't he, when he's at his most low point, and that's obviously not appropriate.
But do you think the resolution? Because when I read this, I felt very, very sorry for Ed at the end. You do?
At the end?
Yeah.
Oh no, I think there's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel for Ed.
See,
he buys the puppy.
Yeah.
And he understands how Christopher's mind works. Remember, they do the timed meetings. Yeah. And Ed doesn't ever try to push Christopher too far. I feel like that's symbolic of their relationship. You know, if Christopher's running away to London has obviously been the tearing of his relationship with his father, I feel like that's the rebuilding.
See, I found it quite difficult to accept that he lived with Judy, because I think Judy kind of won, in a way, in this battle for his affections between Ed and her without having to do any hard work, which I think is quite a harsh way of looking at it. But I just felt so sorry for Ed that, personally, I think he came from a good place, and he was punished by not having Christopher at the end.
But gosh, you've thrown me in this. I think there's light at the end of the tunnel for that family.
Yes.
They're not going to be. It's not all, you know, oh, little cottage roses round the door. They're not going to be back, the three of them as a unit, but I feel like all three of them understand each other better.
Yes.
I see what you mean about Ed actually losing Christopher, as, you know, he is no longer the main carer, I suppose. Yeah.
But no, like you say, the whole, again, going back to context, it's all about families. And I think you could say, in a way, you could argue that this family has become much closer, geographically, obviously, because Judy's back in
Judy's
Swindon.
back in town.
And I think you could also argue that them, like you say, they're self-aware.
Yes.
So I think would you say Christopher is? Because at the end of the play, he's the one that goes, I can do anything, Siobhan, can't I? And she doesn't say anything, which I think reinforces the idea that he can't.
Yes, and my interpretation is she doesn't want to burst his bubble, let him have his moment, but let's not tell him he can do anything, because that will be unrealistic.
That'd be a lie, and he doesn't lie.
Yes, and he doesn't like lies. Self-awareness for Christopher, I don't know if, because one of the things associated with his condition is lack of self-awareness.
Exactly.
And inability to sort of understand yourself, and indeed emotional intelligence with others. But I still think that he moves in the right direction throughout the play.
Yes. Well, he goes on this quest, doesn't he? This adventure, which for him is something that he would never think he could do. So I think he's opened up his world. But does that mean anything once he gets back to Swindon? I mean, he went to London. Would he do it again?
I think he'll go, well, we're talking about him as if he's real.
I know.
I think he will be an academic.
Yeah.
He won't, because he'll never develop the social skills that, you know, an empathetic, emotionally intelligent, neurotypical person would have. But he's clearly very academic, and with the right support, I think he'll have a very fulfilling life.
See, the reason why I asked that question is I feel like the end of the play is quite sad, because I feel like it leaves the audience realising how difficult his life is going to be.
Yes.
And also the reason why the reason why I said that what do you think happens is the fact that, because this is all about the family, I think that family will always struggle, because I don't think that he will ever, you know, he will always have these needs, quite obviously, and how much pressure will that put on Ed and Judy, and for how long? That's what I was sort of talking about. It's like,
but I think that I mean, you and I have spoken in the past, Miss, about how we've both got experience of mental health issues in our own families, and it does. You know, you watch programs on the news about people who were terribly ill and now they're completely better, terribly ill and now they're completely better. The reality of mental health problems is that they're for life, and I think usually, and I think that what the play is, the way the play is trying to be optimistic is to show that even families where that challenge exists can make the best lives they can, but it's not going to disappear, is it?
No. And I think if I was going to sort of conclude this, I would say that the end of the play suggests that this family, they've all gone, like, in this sort of moment in time, if the whole of the family's life is here, we've got like this teeny tiny bit, and I think there's been massive progression amongst all of them, but actually, personally, I think it's not a particularly positive ending because of that, of the cliffhanger. And we know a lot about Christopher, he's got this particular mind, but at the end of the day, it's still the three of them, and I still think that they're, as a family, they will still struggle. There's no resolution, is there?
No,
it's not.
But I think it would almost be a bit twee if there was a resolution in a way.
Absolutely.
Because, well, as I was saying, there usually isn't a resolution to those kind of problems, is there?
No. Anything else, Miss?
No, I feel like that's a slightly low note to end on. Sorry.
The play. I think the play ends on a low note, so we will end this on a low note.
Okay.
So, this is Miss Henry. I am Miss Sonnet. As always, our producer is Mr. Lavington. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that it has helped you. Bye bye.